15,200! 15,200! Fire!
Blimey, don't them Jerry's ever sleep. Hello, I'm Bombardier Jenkins, well, Ricky Jenkins. Just on my way back from the cookhouse to the gun position. The aim of this video is to promote a charity walk I want to do on behalf of SSAFA and the local Greek veterans charity, hopefully. For the anniversary, the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Crete to take place in May next year, 2021. I just thought a good way to promote it is to tell you about one of the stories of one of the units. There were many units and many feats of heroism. I couldn't make a video about all of them, it would run into episodes. But I salute every man jack that took part in it. As an ex-gunner, I want to tell you about an all-artillery unit. That unit is 234 Heavy Anti-Aircraft Battery of 89th Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment. You'll be intrigued about the story, and like I say, we're going to go for that. I'll tell you more about the walk and details about the walk at the end of the video. Jesus. I call it Forgotten Battery. Remember their name, 234 Heavy Anti-Aircraft Battery. Now the story begins back in the UK, about 1,600 miles in that direction. Okay, so I'm going to take you there. So... Jesus. Come on, drive right.
89th Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment was formed in the late 1930s in England's Garden, Kent. The regiment consisted of 3 gun batteries and a regimental headquarters. 205 Battery, along with RHQ, were based in Sittingbourne, 235 Battery at Margate, and the men of 234 Battery were based at Deal. Each battery were equipped with 8 3.7-inch guns termed heavy anti-aircraft, and each battery split into 2 troops, each with 4 guns. With a crew of 7, it could engage targets up to 35,000 feet at 20 rounds per minute, and with a weight of 8 tons, it could be brought into action in 15 minutes. In September 1940, 89th Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment was ordered to prepare for operations overseas. In December 1940, they embarked on the transport ship SS Sfakia Canterbury, bound for Egypt. The regiment sailed with a strength of 49 officers and 1,419 men, including an attached signal section, workshop and transport. They arrived in Egypt in February 1941. In April 1941, the regiment was split. 205 Battery was transferred to British troops Egypt. 235 Battery was sent to Tobruk, and the men of 234 Battery were sent to Crete to bolster defences after the Allied evacuations from Greece. Their destination in Crete, Suda Bay, situated on the northwest coast, a deep natural harbour where Allied ships docked to offload troops and stores, including rations, weapons and ammunition. It became a focal point of attack for the Luftwaffe in pursuit of their aim to invade the island. And the men of 234 Battery were sent there to defend it.
I'm here now at a place called Malaxa. It's high above the port of Suda, and it's where another anti-aircraft gun position, not 234 Battery, but it was where another one was positioned. Now you can see down there the port of Suda. Okay, and there's the Aquitiri Peninsula. There were other gun positions dotted all around this bay to protect the port here. There's the town of Hanya, and beyond that, further along there is Malmö, which the Germans were aiming for. They aimed to take that airfield to bring in reinforcements and supplies. Now, just down there, you may just be able to see the Commonwealth War Cemetery, just down there. And right troop of 234 heavy anti-aircraft battery were positioned in the flat ground just over there. This is where the gliders came down and the paratroopers, in this valley here, just south of Hanya. Obviously, due to urbanisation, the town has spread out in all directions, west, east and south. But fortunately, the gun position, or the area down there, is still olive groves. So we'll pop down there and have a look.
Here's a photo of the bay in 1941. You can see the bombed shipping, including the cruiser HMS York, which was hit by an Italian torpedo boat and run aground.
So let's go down here, shall we? Come on.
The port was a hive of activity, with ships bringing in thousands of troops from mainland Greece and from North Africa for the anticipated invasion by the Axis powers. It was continually being bombed by the enemy.
Well, here I'm at Suda Bay, and it was here on the 24th of April 1941 the 234 heavy anti-aircraft battery disembarked from an old ferry called the Ulster Prince. As soon as they disembarked and their feet touched the ground, the air raid sirens went off and they were immediately run for shelter. Later that day they were asked to, or they were ordered to take shelter in an olive grove about a mile in that direction. A few weeks later, that olive grove became famous as the Battle of 42nd Street. Now, 42nd Street was named after the 42nd Field Company Royal Engineers, because they were camped there, in which the Anzacs did their famous bayonet charge against the advancing Germans. It was a victorious battle in which they delayed the Germans from advancing on the evacuating British soldier or Allied soldiers. The Anzacs lost 52 men and the Germans lost 280, I believe. The following day, the 25th of April, their guns arrived. They were following on in another ship. The men were split, as is with most modern gun batteries today in the artillery. They're split into two troops. Right troop was sent about 2 miles that way to set up their guns, and left troop was sent along the bay to set up their guns at Suda Point.
Left troop set up their gun position about 4.5 miles east of the port on the south side of the bay, near to the entrance of the bay. Here's a photograph from that position at that time.
On the 14th of May, deployed to Suda Point. This is Suda Point. Now, in the war diaries of the battery, 234 battery, it says that they deployed at 700 feet above sea level, and this is 700 feet above sea level. They did move twice. They moved 600 yards in that direction, westwards, but it was found that they were more exposed and they were bombed, and it was reported that 2 500-pound bombs hit the gun position, but fortunately never went off. The men used Matador gun tractors to pull their guns, 8-ton guns, and to pull it up here, this place here, which has got quite a commanding view over the bay, to the entrance to the bay. It took 2 Matador gun tractors to pull each of their 4 guns up to their positions, and this is one of their gun positions. The gunners, on their downtime, used to walk to the local village. It was probably Aptera, the local village, to pick up carafes of wine to drink. They had no means of making sandbags to protect the gun pits here because of the rocky ground. So what they used to do was just build it out of rocks and boulders. And what the Stukas used to do to attack the port, which is in that direction, they used to come flying in. There's the White Mountains there, the Lefka-Ori. The Stukas used to come in out of the sun. The sun was always over there. They'd come over here, so the gunners were blind because of the sun, and then they'd take a left turn and fly down the bay to dive bomb the port of Suda. They were using ammunition that was salvaged from one of the damaged ships that had sunk in the bay. So when they fired, it very often went off prematurely. Fortunately, they sustained no injuries either from the two 500-pound bombs or the premature explosion ammunition. When the gunners actually engaged the Stuka dive bombers or the aircraft coming in to attack the port of Suda, which is down the bay there, they actually had to depress their barrels lower than 0 degrees. They could see the pilots. For the gunners of both left troop and right troop, don't forget this is the left troop's position, their firing was so excessive that you could visibly see that their barrels were bent, and in some cases they were burst, and they were told that there were no replacements for these barrels. It was later discovered by a British prisoner of war who was made to clear a warehouse down in the port of Suda after capture, that there were stacks of them in the warehouse, but they were never supplied. The gunners of left troop couldn't actually see their comrades from right troop. Right troop were right down the other end of the bay. You can just see the ferries there now in the port of Suda, and then there's some flat ground. The town you can see in the background is Hanya. The guns were just to the left over that spit of land sticking out there. Now, although they couldn't see them or know what was happening to them, they could hear the attack going in, or the sound of the battle, the noise of the battle, and they could see the smoke, but they didn't realise the murderous atrocities that were going on.
The rate of fire from the guns was so intense that many of the gunners went deaf for weeks.
On the 26th of May 1941, the order came to evacuate to the south of the island down to Sfakia. So what the men did of the troop, they spiked their guns and they made their way down the mountain. As they were going down the mountain, they found another gun position, which is abandoned by the Royal Marines. Now the Royal Marines had left the guns fully operational. They'd also left stacks of ammunition, so if the enemy were to overrun the position, which they would have done because it had been evacuated, then of course it would have left the guns for the use of the enemy. So the boys of 234 left troop spiked them guns too and destroyed the ammunition. Let me take you back to the 20th of May and to right troop's position, which is about 6 or 7 miles westwards in that direction. Let's go down now.
Green 105 and the 30. Green 112 and the 30.
According to the war diaries compiled by Right Troop Commander Lieutenant Corbett, their gun position was 2,500 yards due south of Hanya, 4,500 yards due west of Suda Docks, and 3,000 yards east of Galatas. That will put them around about here, and this ties in with a map made just prior to the invasion. Their guns were facing eastwards towards the docks.
So here we are in the vicinity of that gun position, of right troop gun position. Now you got to understand that these olive trees at the time, 80 years ago, were only about 2.5 feet tall. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you the layout of the gun position at the time. Okay, so this is orientated as well. So here we've got a road running north to south. So Hanya's up there. We've got the 4 guns that were always laid out, or mostly laid out, in a horseshoe pattern. So you've got number 1 gun, number 2 gun, number 3 gun, and number 4 gun. The command post, or CP, was generally about 15 yards from the front 2 guns. Their tented area and cookhouse, etc., was on the other side of the road here. So when they wanted to rest or get their breakfast or whatever, or get their meals, they'd go back here. Unknown to the boys of 234 Battery, they were to be a victim of their own success. Their hit rate on German aircraft coming into the port of Suda and over Hanya was devastating to the German fighters and bombers. The overhead camouflage of the gun position was pretty poor, as discovered when they found aerial reconnaissance photographs in the possession of a dead German officer. The gunners inflicted a heavy toll on aircraft that were attacking the port and Hanya. So much so it worried the Germans that they deemed the gunners to be a serious threat to the forthcoming airborne invasion. So much so that they specifically tasked paratroopers and glider troops to take out the guns. The gunners reverted to open sight action, meaning direct firing, no instruments, there wasn't time. Suda port was getting murdered, and the sheer volume of German aircraft coming over was overwhelming. A bomb struck number 3 gun pit. All the crew were injured. The Stukas and ME-109s were bombing and strafing the whole of the gun position. Lieutenant Corbett, the gun position officer, or GPO, ordered the injured men to retreat back to the tent line. When the bombing and strafing ceased, it was just moments later when the German gliders began landing right on top of the gun position. 9 gliders, each carrying 10 heavily armed troops, were tasked with neutralising the guns. These men were led by Lieutenant Gentz. Only 1 glider failed to make the landing zone. Of the 150 men in Right Troop, they were only issued with 8 rifles, and 4 of them were with the wagon lines a couple of 100 yards away. Plus they were issued with 2 Lewis machine guns. The 2 Lewis machine guns were located with 1 at number 1 gun and 1 at number 4 gun to protect the flanks. Manning one of the Lewis guns, near number 1 gun, was Gunner Reed. One of the gliders came hurtling in and landed almost on top of number 1 gun. It came in, wind whistling under its wings, sparks flying off its skids as it was hitting the rocks and boulders, and the wings falling off. As it came to a halt, Gunner Reed opened fire with his Lewis gun and killed every occupant. He then ripped the Lewis gun from its tripod and started using it as if it was his own personal small arm. Many gunners on the position, or the survivors, thought he should have got the VC. After the gliders landed, the gunners had to fight for their lives. Don't forget they only had 4 rifles and just their bare hands. Back at the command post, Troop Commander and Gun Position Officer Lieutenant Corbett was fighting off the Germans with his rifle. Lieutenant Stebbins, who just happened to be a nephew of the regiment's commanding officer, was doing the same at number 3 gun pit. When the Germans overran the gun, obviously with superior firepower, they ordered the occupants to come out with their hands up. They did this, but were shot in cold blood, despite being wounded. The Germans then blew the roof off the command post with a trench mortar, and that's when the men of 234 knew that the game was up. Gunner Stan Upton, who was inside the command post at the time, along with another gunner, Charlie Milner. Stan Upton pulled out his cigarette packet, pulled out a fag, stuck it in his mouth and lit it. Charlie turns round to Stan and says, "Come away from the door." Before he could finish his sentence, the Germans had machine gunned through the door, and Stan died smoking. Lieutenant Gentz, the commander of the German glider company, then appeared, and in perfect English he shouted, "If you want to come out of there alive, come out now." Charlie Milner emerged carrying an injured sergeant. Sergeant Goldfinch, a veteran of the First World War. Charlie himself was injured. He'd earlier been shot in the hand and one of his fingers was hanging off. As they emerged from the command post, there were about 10 Germans stood there like a firing squad, and they just opened fire on the surrendering wounded gunners. As they was raked with machine gun fire, Charlie fell, still carrying the injured sergeant. He fell over the body of one of his fellow gunners. Sergeant Goldfinch was shot. Charlie lay there waiting for the second burst to come in, but it didn't come. He later found out why. One of the Germans had accidentally shot a German officer. He was rolling around on the ground holding his stomach, cursing the guy, the German that had opened fire. So they obviously thought it a bad idea. Those Germans had shot the gunners in cold blood. As Charlie was lying there, he was going to die anyway, so he just started cursing the Germans. The air turned blue. But the second burst didn't come. And Charlie thanked the Lord that the Germans didn't understand English. At that moment, only 7 survivors were accounted for out of 150 men. The Germans made them wounded survivors then retrieve the German dead and wounded. They wouldn't let them retrieve their own dead or tend to their own wounded. Not even the Germans attended to the British wounded. It's thought that a lot of the men, having laid out there all day without being tended to, died of dehydration or bled out. They simply died of German neglect. Charlie himself had to covertly take a field dressing off of one of the dead gunners for his own injury. He'd used his own field dressing on the then injured sergeant. At about 1800 hours, the Germans got wind of an imminent attack by the British to retake the guns. The Germans then marched the British survivors to a slit trench at the back of the gun position. The Germans jumped into the slit trench, then ordered the gunners to lay down as human sandbags. At one point during the day, it's documented that they saw 2 gunner sergeants lying down, face down, next to each other, each with a bullet hole in the nape of the neck. It was an obvious execution. The Germans started to massacre the gunners after surrender. Wounded men massacred. Gunner John Clough was lying on his side in gun pit number 2 when he could see thousands and thousands of paratroopers landing to the west over the village of Galatas. The massacre went on. Gunner John Clough lay there and watched it unfold. At one point, a gunner, Jock Ferns, was shot in cold blood. He didn't die immediately. Gunner John Clough could hear him shouting, "You effing bastards," and then he died. Gunner Clough lay there for 30 minutes and then he decided to crawl out. As he crawled out, there was a German officer stood there with a Luger in his hand. He thought he was going to die, but the Germans simply ordered him to go to the command post. The Germans then proceeded to lay charges in the breeches of the guns and cut the comms cables. The surviving gunners were held in a tent all day with no food or water. If the Germans found any surviving gunners in the slit trenches, they'd shoot them in cold blood. A witness to this was Gunner Crosley, who was laying in one of the slit trenches, and the rim of his steel helmet got hit twice, and he also got shot in the back of the hand, but he survived. Back at the command post was Lieutenant Corbett, who had been shot through the face. They later found out that a Lieutenant Kokolis had been shot while surrendering. In the words of Gunner Clough, "Callous bastards and cold-blooded murder." On another occasion, a team of drivers was trained up as a spare gun crew, and they were actually manning gun number 1. During the battle, because of the lack of weapons, they retreated into a shelter. Well, it was more like a hole in the ground. The Germans threw hand grenades into the shelter. 2 gunners were injured. One very seriously, Gunner Banforth. He was in so much agony that he said to the rest of the guys, "Look, I've got to go out." So he emerged from the shelter with his hands in the air, and the Germans cut him in 2 with a machine gun. Lieutenant Jones, who was also in the shelter, he turned around to the guys in the shelter and said that, "Let me go out. As an officer, they may not shoot." He too went out with his hands raised in the air, and he too was shot. 7 or 8 men had actually entered the shelter, and now there were 2 of them were dead. Another one in the shelter was Gunner Alf Hay. Now Alf Hay, they'd gone into the shelter about 9 o'clock in the morning, and it was now about 5:45 in the evening. All of a sudden they could hear a whistle. Sergeant Hooker, who was also in the shelter, he later ended up with 11 bullet wounds down one side of his body. Sergeant Hooker said to Alf, take a peek outside. When Alf looked outside, all he could see was, again, cold-blooded murder, men just being massacred, wounded men in their trenches. A few minutes later, he heard a whistle. Now, he knew that the Germans had whistles, so he thought that they were Germans, and he didn't really want to compromise himself, having been stuck in the shelter all day. It was then that he realised that the whistle was from a Royal Marines officer. The Royal Marines had taken back the gun position. It's documented that the remainder of the men in the shelter, they remained quiet. They obviously weren't going out to a slaughter, and they remained quiet all day. And the Germans actually mounted a heavy machine gun for the rest of the day on top of the shelter. As evening was setting in, the gunners, they could see shadowy figures darting about in the olive groves. Shortly after, a Bren carrier was seen driving past their position. The gunners were in the basement of this house by now, and the Germans were upstairs with a machine gun. The Bren came down the Hanya Road from north to south. At first, it made a feint, and then it double backed on itself, went to the front of the house and opened fire with its machine gun. The figures that were darting about in the dark in the olive groves then came around the back of the house to cut off any retreat that the Germans may wish to do. However, all the Germans were neutralised. Gunner Alf Hay sustained shrapnel wounds to both his legs when the Germans threw the hand grenades into the shelter, and he was casevaced to a monastery which was not too far away. In there he was laid. There was Germans and Commonwealth soldiers alike, and he noticed that the Germans were very nervous because he knew that despite there being a big red cross on the roof of the monastery, he knew that the Germans would bomb it anyway. Eventually, Alf was further casevaced to a first aid post in a school, probably in the village of Kalivas. In the school, Alf was laid on a stretcher in between the beds that were placed in the school, and next to him was an Aussie lad. The Aussie lad asked him if Alf smoked. Alf said yeah. He said, well, here's some papers and here's some pouch of tobacco. Alf said, I've never rolled one of them in my life. So the Aussie lad said, give it here, I'll roll it for you. And Alf, when he lit up the fag, he said it was the best thing he'd tasted in years. While he was still smoking the cigarette, a Stuka dive-bombed the school, opened up its machine guns, which came through the window, and the Aussie lad was shot in the head and died there and then. Alf was covered in his blood because, of course, he was on the floor lower than the Aussie lad in the bed. Gunner Edward Lawrence was a telephonist on duty in the tent lines when the Germans came through, and he witnessed the Germans killing and murdering the gunners in their trenches. Gunner Lawrence was one of the lucky ones. He had a rifle, and he carried on fighting the Germans until he ran out of ammo. They issued no more than 50 rounds per man. And in his own words, Gunner Lawrence says he could not see the necessity for the carnage and the killing that went on, and many gunners thought that these Germans were actually on drugs. Gunner Lawrence was wounded in both legs through shrapnel wounds. Gunner Lawrence was then casevaced to the 1st Field Dressing Station, an Australian unit, and while he was there, he was actually still a bit nervous because he'd seen what the Germans done at the 7th General Field Hospital near a town called Morneys. When the Germans reached there, they simply threw hand grenades, entered the tented accommodation, just threw hand grenades under the beds of the wounded. Those relieving forces were the Royal Marines, so they're forgiven for leaving their guns in an operational state back at Suda Point. That particular unit of Marines were based in Deal, which is where members of 234 Battery were stationed in Kent, so they knew a lot of the faces there, which was good. However, they were met with the murderous atrocities. The sights were horrific. The Germans fled, leaving only their wounded. By this time now, the Royal Marines had retaken the gun position, and the gunners could now collect their own wounded and dead on the gun position. All they could do was simply turn the earth in the slit trenches where the dead gunners lay. There was only about 38 survivors of about 150 men, and most of them were wounded. They were then transferred to left troop, who were up at Suda Point, and from there they were either surrendered or tried to make it to Sfakia on the south coast for evacuation by the Royal Navy.
The battle raged for another 6 days before the order came to evacuate to Sfakia on the south coast.
Lane 105 and the 30. Lane 112 and the 30. On target! And the 31, that's on target. Engage! 15-200! 15-200!
Lieutenant Corbett, Right Troop Commander, was the only surviving officer on this site. All senior NCOs and near to 70 men being killed, also 30 wounded, in nearly every case having no weapons with which to even protect themselves. From the accounts given, it is obvious that the battery did excellent shooting and accounted for a great number of planes. The barrage fire over the harbour was most effective. Lieutenant Corbett's account of the catastrophe to the Right Troop shows the vital necessity of arming all personnel, as all spare men were simply mown down defenceless in the trenches, the gun crews being bombed and finally shot in the gun pits. In spite of the inequality of arms, all but 20 of the enemy were either killed or wounded. And as there were at least 3 officers in the attacking forces, there must have been 50 or 60 men from the gliders, besides paratroops who came through the olive groves. From Lieutenant Corbett's account, it will be seen that had there been sufficient wire for proper wiring of the site and rifles and grenades available, a very different story would have been told. The Royal Artillery historian describes 234 Battery as a very gallant battery who had defended their guns to the last and took a terrible toll of their attackers in those terrible few minutes. Of the 12 officers and 347 other ranks who landed in Crete, 234 Battery's total casualties in the campaign were 77 killed in action and 187 missing, believed to be prisoners of war. Many of them wounded. Only 30 wounded members of the battery managed to get back to Egypt. General Headquarters Middle East ordered the depleted 234 Battery's disbandment, which was carried out on the 1st of July 1941. The survivors were posted to 16 Battery of 2nd Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment. Most of the men of 234 Battery who fought so bravely and died during the battle now rest peacefully in a quiet corner of the very bay they were defending. Lieutenant Corbett was awarded the Military Cross and Sergeant Hooker the Military Medal. 234 Heavy Anti-Aircraft Battery was actually a territorial army unit. The only memorial I can find dedicated to them, apart from their actual tombstones and their names on the Phaleron Memorial in Athens, is the stained glass window in St George the Martyr Church in Ramsgate, Kent. John, or Jack Clough, made it to Egypt aboard HMS Phoebe, a Dido-class destroyer. Eddie Lawrence made it back to Egypt aboard HMS Abdul, a mine-laying cruiser. Charlie Milner also made it back to Egypt. Alf Hay ended up as a prisoner of war. And this is the only surviving photograph of the unit I can find anywhere. Surviving members of the whole Allied forces of approximately 32,000 men who had not been captured or seriously wounded made their way to Sfakia on the south coast. It was a march of approximately 40 miles or 64 kilometres over the White Mountains, which are 13,000 feet or so high. With no food, very little water, and some men without boots, they made their way south. Over the next few nights, over 16,000 men were evacuated by the Royal Navy. Unfortunately, 5,000 had to be left in Sfakia.
Many of the captured Allied soldiers in Sfakia were forced to march back across the mountains, back to the Suda Bay area where they'd just come from. To coincide with the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Crete, I'm going to walk in the footsteps of those men from Sfakia on the south coast across the White Mountains to Suda Bay War Cemetery, where I hope to arrive there in time for the official ceremony to lay a wreath on behalf of the British Commonwealth and the Greek forces that made such a sacrifice during the Battle of Crete, and also to the Greek civilians who paid a heavy price at the hands of the Nazis. You'll find the Just Giving link all through the video. All proceeds go to SSAFA, the Soldiers, Sailors, Airmen's and Families Association, so please give generously. And here's to the boys of 234. Cheers. Oh, I suppose I better start getting fit now.
105 and the 30. Bearing 112 and the 30. On target! And the 31. Left on target. Engage. 15,200. 15,200.